Hello, good afternoon. This is Will Levy with the Office of Recapitalization here at HUD. We apologize for the delay in getting this started, but we are now online with a recorded webinar that will cover two topics, two short notices that were published early last week. We'll walk through each of the notices as well as have time at the end for questions and answers. So for folks who've done this with us before, we have there's a window on the side of the webinar where you can ask questions. Make sure that you have dialed into the number and entered your audio PIN so that you can so we can hear you and you can hear us. You can also write in questions in the bottom window of that screen. Okay. So let's get started. So the first of the two notices that we're going to discuss today, it was published in the Federal Register, technically published on July 3rd, 2018. It's called Rental Assistance Demonstration, Implementation of Certain Fiscal Year 2018 Appropriations Act Provisions. So as background, the 2018 Appropriations Act, signed on March 23rd, expanded the public housing cap to 455,000 units. This from what it previously was of 225,000 units. Now there are over 133,000 units that are on the waiting list and that can now be awarded because the cap was increased. That leaves about 97,000 units remaining that have not been reserved and that could be available for new applicants. The 2018 Appropriations Act also made certain changes to RAD's second component, which covers the rent supplement, rental assistance payment, mod rehab, SRO, and now 202 PHAS. And it importantly substantially increased the public housing capital fund appropriation over FY17 levels. Okay, so getting back into what this notice does. So one of the big questions that we have to establish an answer to when we have a cap increase is for new awards, how will we set the rents? Typically, each time that the cap has been increased, we've updated the rents. We certainly wanted to make sure to incorporate the higher FY18 capital fund levels out of concern that if we did not, the program would slow down. But the operating fund is, which is one of the important pieces of the RAD rent, is not available until the end of the fiscal year. So what we did is we developed these, what we call modified FY16 RAD rents, which we published on our website. The modified FY16 RAD rents continues to use the FY16 operating fund and the FY16 tenant rents, but then replaces the FY16 capital fund with the FY18 capital fund levels. And this computes to the modified FY16 RAD rents, which on average nationwide are some $62 per unit month higher than FY16 levels. So who will use these modified FY16 RAD rents? Well, first of all, any awards that we issue before the end of the year will use these levels. So that includes the likely the 133,000 units or so that are coming off of the waiting list now and which we're processing CHAPS and other awards for. But in addition, any pre-existing awards, so anybody who has a CHAP where the PHA requests an amendment to their CHAP to switch out the rents with these modified FY16 RAD rent levels, can do so. And we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. So as you said, before the end of the year, any awards issued will have the modified 2016 RAD rents. After this year, so starting January 1, 2019, we'll be able to issue, calculate and issue rents that are based on fully based on FY18 rent levels. So it'll include the FY18 operating fund, the FY18 tenant rents, and the FY18 capital fund. It will more purely be called FY18 RAD rents. at any point prior to closing, so one of the things the Federal Register Notice does is it establishes at any point prior to closing, a PHA can withdraw an active award and request new RAD authority without submitting a new application. So this is, uses the words withdrawal, but really we're treating this as an amendment. You don't need to submit a new application. You're keeping the same CHAP issuance date you originally had. So you simply come into us and say, I'd like to use the modified FY16 rent levels, or if we're talking next year, I'd like to use the FY18 RAD rent levels. You can do this any point prior to closing. And when you make that request, the rents will be set based on the applicable RAD rent base year at the time. So again, any CHAP holder today could request can request a CHAP to be amended to reflect the modified FY16 rent levels. And after January 1, 2019, anybody can request a CHAP amendment to incorporate FY18 RAD rents once we calculate them. Just to frame it another way, in a table, this shows the history of how we've set the rents over time. So in the original 60,000 unit cap, we used a RAD rent base year from FY 2012. When the cap was increased from 60,000 units to 185,000 units, we used FY 14 as the RAD rent base year. When it was increased from 185,000 units to 225,000 units, we used the FY 16 RAD rent base year. Between now and the end of the year, we're using these modified FY 16 rents. And then on or after January 1, 2019, we're using FY 18 RAD rents. And anybody is eligible, just looking at the far right of the table, everybody is eligible to come in for a CHAP amendment to update their RAD rent to the base year applicable at the time. Okay, enough on that topic. We'll move on to a couple of other items dealing with public housing conversions that are addressed in the Federal Register Notice. First, how we're making awards off the waiting list. First, HUD expects to make awards within 60 days of submission of applications. So for a bunch of folks on the waiting list, we have applications. We're well on our way through reviewing them and expect to make those awards within 60 days. And then PHAs that had submitted letters of interest in order to put themselves on the waiting list have until September 4th, 2018 to submit a RAD application, portfolio award, or multi-phase award. So we've notified all those, aside from the Federal Register going out, we've notified all of those PHAs of this deadline. If we don't receive your materials by September 4th, 2018, we have to, we'll let go of the reservation. But because we have a decent amount of cap space now, anybody who does miss the deadline should we expect to be able to come back in within a reasonable time and still get an award. Just remember, though, as we stated earlier, we have 97,000 units left unreserved, approximately, and we expect that's going to move pretty quickly. We expect probably within the next year we might consume much of that. Okay, so and lastly, the last thing I want to talk about on public housing conversions is that for any multi-phase awards issued after March 22nd, 2018, PHAs have until September 30th, 2024 to submit applications for the final phase of that multi-phase award. Any previously awarded multi-phase awards, HUD can extend on a case-by-case basis. So talk with your transaction manager about that. Okay, moving on to the second component of RAD. There were three important changes that the FY18 Appropriations Act made on the second component. The furthest reaching one, this Federal Register Notice doesn't address at all. So that's, this is actually the third bullet on this page. the FY18 Appropriations Act authorized the conversion of Section 202 PHAS under RAD. That's going to take a bit more work for us to develop, and we expect to implement that through a forthcoming revision 4 of the RAD notice. But the two other changes that the statute made, we did incorporate in this Federal Register notice. The first has to do with rent setting for rents up and RAP conversions, which there's just about 20 some odd properties left. And the statute authorizes for those properties in high cost areas, which we've defined as those identified in Housing Notice 2017-06, rents will be set at the comparable market rent without regard to the HUD published fair market rent. The other important change applies to all of the second component conversions, so rent sub, RAP, mod rehab, SRO, and when rolled out, the 202 PRACs, which is a prohibition against rescreening. This copies over statutory language that we have for public housing conversions, and it prohibits the conversion from being the basis for rescreening or termination of assistance or eviction of any tenant family in a property participating in the demonstration, and deems that such a family shall not be considered a new admission for any purpose, including compliance with income targeting. So just a very important resident protection. We had previously in the RAD notices gone as far as we could in guaranteeing that residents could remain in properties, but there were some statutory issues that this language is very helpful in ensuring that all residents will get to remain or return at sites. Okay, we're now going to move on to questions. Yeah, I think actually that's a good idea. Let's take a break right now and take questions on the Federal Register notice. Should we start with some written questions or some? Okay. So the first question is, how can we calculate the impact of the 2016 RAD rents to ensure they will be higher than the 2014 rents plus OCAF increases in our current CHAP? So all you need to do is compare what the number that is in your CHAP today with the numbers that we've published on the RAD website. And HUD.gov/RAD, we have published the modified 2016 RAD rents. Those rents will not be eligible for an OCAF until next year. So we're treating them as if they're kind of this year's rents starting this way. So for an apples to apples comparison to figure out which is higher, compare what is in your CHAP today, which should reflect any OCAF increases, with the rents that are published, that we've published on our website. Follow-up question, which I'll just reiterate. The question is, should we add 2017 and 2018 OCAFs to the 2016 modified rents? And the answer is no. The first OCAF for which the modified 2016 rents will be eligible for is the 2019 OCAF. Let's see if there are any other questions.
When you said they could come in,
Sure. Okay. So another question is, how does somebody make a request to for these modified 2016 rents? So the same way you would make a request to modify a utility allowance in your CHAP or to utilize one of the rent flexibilities, talk to your transaction manager, or if you're in closing, talk to your closing coordinator, and we will adjust the rents in the CHAP. For those who've already gotten your rehab assistance payment number, that will also be affected. So especially for those in closing who are expecting a certain rehab assistance payment number, that number might be also a little higher when choosing the modified 2016 RAD rents. Another question, how can you request 2016 modified rents and utility allowance savings for resident paid utility CHAP adjustments? I think the second part of that question is going to be covered in the next part of this presentation. Again, we're treating these all as chap amendments. So the same way we've done any kind of chap amendment before, which is you talk to you submit the request to your transaction manager, and we process those. We're prioritizing the processing of any of those that are in closing, but otherwise expect kind of standard turnaround times for any other chap amendment request. We were asked also about the 2018 RAD rents. No, they're not posted, and that's because we can't post, we can't calculate the 2018 RAD rents until the end of the fiscal year when operating fund data is finalized. So near the end of this year, we will publish the FY 2018 RAD rents. There is, I assume one of the questions underneath that is, well, what if the 2018 RAD rents are better than the modified 2016 RAD rents? There is absolutely no harm in somebody requesting the modified 2016 RAD rents now because they're higher than what might be in your chap, and then in 6 months coming back and requesting another amendment to use the FY 2018 RAD rents. That's totally fine with us. So about the turnaround time of the applications, we were asked, what about awards for applications that are already on the waiting list? So applications that we've received, when should folks expect their chaps? Those are actively under review. I don't know if we expect that within 60 days of the notice going out, we'll be able to turn those chaps around. Of course, the notice had to establish what the rents will be, so which is an important part of the chap issuance. So that's our goal. As with every year, the rates we published are net of utilities. They're just the contract rents. On top of that, in your chap, we add the utility allowance that you tell us are the utility allowances at the public housing site that you're proposing for conversion. There's a question about the second component, ban on rescreening, which of course also applies under the first component of RAD, and how does it impact when you layer in other funding sources in the recapitalization, such as tax credits? Both still apply. So you may not rescreen a family, and families have a right of return under RAD. And so that means if you are using tax credits at a site, that resident either has to, you'd either, and a resident would not be eligible for tax credits, then either you keep that unit off of tax credit basis, or that resident would need to have voluntarily accepted another option to live elsewhere, completely up to the resident. We're asked, can we ask for the 2018 the modified 2016 RAD rents if we've already closed in 2017? No, you can only make the request if you have an active chap, where the closing and the recordation has not yet occurred. We're asked, how many units of public housing exceed the new 455,000 unit cap? So there's approximately 1,050,000 public housing units left in the inventory. So on top of the 450,000, that's 600,000. We were asked, are mod rehab properties eligible for market rents? So when mod rehab properties convert, their rents are based on market, but are on comparable market rents, but are still capped at, for PBRA conversions, up to 120% of the fair market rent, and for PPV conversions, up to 110% of the fair market rent. And then we're asked, will this PowerPoint be distributed to webinar registrants? Yes, we, as always, we will post the PowerPoint as well as a recording of the webinar on the RAD resource desk after the webinar. Okay, so we'll take a break in questions and move on to the RAD supplemental notice. And then after this next piece of the presentation, we'll go back to questions. Okay, so the RAD supplemental notice is a joint housing and PIH notice, Housing Notice 2018-05, PIH Notice 2018-11, published on July 2nd. It makes 5 discrete changes to Section 1, just related to the public housing conversions. And the changes amend directly Revision 3 of the RAD notice, with the goal of making RAD simpler and more effective. We've published both the supplemental notice itself, but also a version of Revision 3 as amended by the supplemental notice. So if you like to have a printout of your RAD guidance in one handy-dandy place, we'd recommend you printing out what we've posted as the Revision 3 as amended by the RAD supplemental notice. So the RAD supplemental notice does 5 things, and I'm going to cover the 5th thing first because it is one of the more significant, or possibly the most significant. And it has to do with a new streamlined RAD conversion option for small PHAs. So relevant background. Over 800 of the nation's 3,000 public housing authorities have 50 or fewer public housing units under public housing ACC. That's the annual contributions contract. These agencies own approximately 27,000 units, or only about 2.5% of the total public housing stock. They're typically not staffed to undertake complex HUD programs, but there are still a lot of advantages for these agencies to move towards the Section 8 platform as the ongoing form of assistance. Meanwhile, PIH Notice 2018-04 authorizes Section 18 disposition approval for PHAs with 50 or fewer units. It makes the disposition under Section 18 much simpler. You don't need to meet the obsolescence test in order to get Section 18 approval. So this streamlined RAD conversion option is very much part of a departmental effort to create more of a toolkit for these agencies. Our goal in developing this option is to make conversion substantially simpler for this population while not taking on undue risk. So starting with eligibility, it's PHAs with 50 or fewer public housing units. This at the time of the request. So a larger PHA, certainly a PHA today with 32 public housing units is eligible. So is a medium-sized PHA who takes a number of units through RAD conventionally and finds itself with one last project that's 45 units with 45 public housing units. They too could use this option, or a much larger PHA in the same boat. The PHA must have a PHAS score of 75 or higher, PHAS score of 30 or higher, and not be PHAS substandard or capital fund troubled. The PHA cannot be proposing construction or rehab or a transfer of assistance or any relocation as part of the conversion. And if converting to project-based vouchers, the PHA voucher administrator must have at least 100 units under its Housing Choice Voucher Annual Contributions Contract, ACC. The 3 main areas that we've streamlined, seems like 3, but these have very important repercussions, is 1, the RAD application has been simplified. And we've actually simplified the RAD application more broadly, not just for small PHAs. Small PHAs would be exempt from the capital needs assessment. And instead, they'd be providing certifications that the PHAs assess the property for any exigent health and safety hazards and has completed any necessary repairs if they found any. The property that they're certifying the property can be sustained for 20 years as decent, safe, and sanitary housing at the published RAD contract rents Of course, to make such a certification, it helps for a PHA to rely on data about the property and in some assessment. But we don't need to see that assessment. The PHA would certify that it has provided the owner with any lead-related records, and the owner has agreed to evaluate and control lead-based paint hazards, and that the site complies with accessibility standards. And this is a very, very important exemption, because once exempt from the CNA, it means that we no longer require that repairs are done as part of the conversion. For most properties that converted into RAD, a CNA is completed, and if there are immediate needs identified, repairs have to be done. And for this population, even if there are immediate needs, but it still meets these other eligibility criteria, and it's made these certifications, it can convert. Because the conversion involves no work, HUD is developing a simplified environmental review, what we call a tiered review, where HUD makes program-wide compliance determinations for most of the related laws and authorities, and completes only a site-specific compliance review for a limited set of laws and authorities. So contamination and flood issues are the main ones. So what's left? So the financing plan requirements, or which probably could be renamed just conversion plan requirements because there is no financing, involves a conversion overview, which is a basic narrative description, type of conversion, PBV or PBRA, the certifications in lieu of the capital needs assessment, a limited environmental review, the fair housing accessibility and relocation checklist, which is really just completed to confirm that none of the trigger items apply. So it's clicking 2 boxes. Sources and uses that simply memorializes that any public housing funds that the PHA has is moving over with the property into a new reserve. An operating pro forma that must have at least $500 per unit per year deposited into a replacement reserve. The estimate of public housing funds available for HAP subsidy, which is just a year of conversion funding requirement. Resident comments and a description of how those comments were incorporated into any plans, and the title report. Really, looking at this list, there's 4 items that require more than a week to complete, and that's the work necessary to do the certifications in lieu of the CNA, the compiling a more limited set of documents for HUD to do the environmental review, having the resident meetings and collecting those comments, and commissioning a title report. Really, the rest of those could be done in very little time. So we think there is a substantial streamlining that's occurred for these small PHAs. What we still need to do, so now that the notice is out, there's 3 areas we know we need to work on. First, we're developing a processing guide for small PHAs so that they're not looking at a 140-page notice plus the RAD supplemental notice. They're looking at a smaller document that tells them only what they need to know, developing those training materials for that. We need to roll out the environmental review, we call tiered review. And more broadly, we're working with PIH on developing a repositioning toolkit for small PHAs, given that many PHAs many of these small PHAs should be evaluating which is the better option, RAD, Section 18, or other options. So all of these are forthcoming. Okay, we'll move on to the remaining items in the supplemental notice. The supplemental notice permits rent bundling between RAD and non-RAD project-based vouchers. So as many folks know, public housing properties that can convert can rent bundle between their RAD conversions. And this extends that to non-RAD PBV contract. So here's a little short example. So you have two 100-unit contracts. One is a RAD PBV contract, and another is a non-RAD PBV contract. The RAD contract has a contract rent of $600, and the non-RAD PBV contract has a rent of $1,000. You can bundle those rents such that they both have rents of $800, which might, in this theoretical case, work still for both properties. If the non-RAD PBV contract could absorb that hit, and the RAD PBV contract is benefiting substantially from that, and is able to undertake whatever project repairs, redevelopment that is needed. When rent bundling, the donor HAP contract must be executed before the recipient HAP contract, and the owner with the non-RAD PBV contract must request this decreased rent and must agree to ongoing OCAF adjustments, just like the RAD contract is, just to ensure that the ongoing costs are comparable. Okay, so go to the next item, PBV, tenant-paid utility savings, and site-specific utility allowances. So what the supplemental notice does is it allows PHAs to elect to establish a site-specific utility allowance for project-based vouchers instead of what they normally do, which is use the standard voucher program-wide utility allowance schedule. Before this notice, PHAs were routinely asking HUD for waivers to allow a site-specific utility allowance. Now, a waiver is no longer needed, it's simply permitted. With the caveat that when a project includes both RAD and non-RAD units, a waiver is still required. HUD is still open to those, and we've put this requirement in so that to make sure that the PHA is requesting the waiver for both contracts and not creating a disparate treatment for the residents. It's useful to have a site-specific utility allowance on its own, in its own right, but it's particularly useful for RAD because when a conversion will result in the reduction of one or more utility components that are used to establish the utility allowance, HUD will permit the RAD contract rent to be increased by 75% of the projected utility savings. So essentially, if you give us an engineering report that shows that if the utility allowance, because of repairs you're doing, will be reduced from $100 to $60, then for a difference of $40, 75% of the $40 or $30 could be added to the contract rent, which can be a nice little rent bump. Okay, moving on. The supplemental notice provides a developer fee incentive for preferences for households exiting homelessness or permanent supportive housing. So this provides a 25% increase in the maximum HUD-allowed developer fee for PHAs and owners that will adopt a waiting list preference for either homeless applicants referred by the local continuum of care and or applicants exiting permanent supportive housing. Certainly, folks are probably well aware of HUD's efforts over the years to reduce and eliminate homelessness, and so the first item probably makes sense to a lot of folks. Just to provide a little context for applicants exiting permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing is often an essential resource to help homeless individuals or families with a disability achieve stable housing. However, at some point, HUD's found that many individuals in permanent supportive housing reach a point where they may no longer need an intensive service environment. These individuals and families may desire to live in a different neighborhood, move closer to family or friends, or seek housing in an area that is more convenient for work or educational opportunities. In addition to being a positive change for the clients, it helps clients move to a less, helping clients move to a less service-intense environment is cost-effective for communities and frees up expensive permanent supportive housing resources for individuals and families who are currently experiencing homelessness and need both a housing and intensive services package. So aligning high service-oriented housing programs with mainstream, less service-intense housing assistance programs provides more options for households experiencing homelessness and creates movement in a community's homeless response system. Just for your background. We'll move on to the next item in the supplemental notice, which has to do with Section 18 applications and RAD. So there's one paragraph. This really does two things. It's one paragraph that closes a potential loophole that was probably unlikely to be used, and that I'm not going to go into great detail in here, but it was a loophole that could have undermined our substantial preservation of assistance goal. So it gives us the authority to reject the RAD conversion if it will be used along with Section 18 and ultimately significantly reduce the assistance. The second thing it does, though, which is important, especially with the new RAD and Section 18 blend that was also rolled out in PIH Notice 2018-04, that we also have an FAQ on the resource desk, is it makes sure that in those blends of RAD and Section 18 that all residents will be subject to the RAD relocation requirements found in PIH Housing and Housing Notice 2016-17. So as an example, without this, residents would have different rights, and so we've decided there's no good policy reason for that. It would create confusion for residents, potential disparities, and so we've chosen to go with what are generally stricter relocation requirements under RAD, which require resident notices and meeting, and require a right to return, dictate certain timing of the relocation, and make residents eligible for URA assistance and payments. Okay, that is all the supplemental notice does. Just to review the materials, again, we've got the Federal Register Notice, implementation of certain fiscal year Appropriation Act provisions. We've published the modified FY16 RAD rents on the website. We have the HUD supplemental guidance and the version of revision 3 of the RAD notice as amended by the supplemental guidance, all up on our website. Okay, so let's go back to questions. What do we have? So first question is, when do you anticipate rolling out the remaining guidance for small PHA conversions? We expect both the processing guidance, so all of it can be implemented now. There's nothing anybody needs to wait for. These are really TA materials, but the processing guidance will probably be done within the next 3 to 4 weeks. We expect the tiered environmental review to probably be within the next 3 or 4 weeks as well. And we'll probably have a better sense of when a broader repositioning toolkit or decision tree to be developed with the Office of Public and Indian Housing would be developed probably over the next few, that'll probably be a little longer time frame over the next few months. We'll probably be testing out materials at speaking engagements and local state conferences, and certainly encourage any feedback on that topic as we develop those materials. 3-part question. Did you say PHAs get to use without having to improve also? Okay, first question. Did I say that PHAs with 50 or fewer units can go through Section 18 and get vouchers without having to prove obsolescence? Yes. PIH Notice 2018-04 says that PHAs with 50 or fewer units do not need to demonstrate that the property is obsolete in order to get approval for disposition, as long as it certifies that it's in the best interest of residents. Vouchers would be issued for occupied units. PHAs could voucher out, issue those vouchers as tenant-based vouchers, or they could project-base those vouchers at the site. So it really does create, along with the RAD streamlined effort, a pretty robust toolkit available for these agencies. Second question, can PHAs work with private developers to go through RAD? Absolutely. PHAs work with consultants. They partner with private developers all the time to support conversion through RAD. Oftentimes, a follow-up question we often get to that is, as long as there are no payments to the developer that are made prior to conversion, public housing procurement rules don't apply. The next question, let's see where it's at. Post-conversion and once under a Section 8 contract, can a PHA refinance the property for rehab needs? Absolutely. Our expectation, and one of the benefits of moving to the Section 8 contract, not only that as part of the conversion, we very often see recapitalization of properties, but down the line, it'll be much easier for owners whenever it's time to make kind of life cycle improvements to properties, that they'll go and get a new loan or take out tax credits after conversion. There's nothing requiring that it happen only at conversion. There's a question about Section 18, which is it available on a first-come, first-served basis? Can we reliably project in our performers getting Section 18 PBVs at the higher rent, or is there a chance that the funding will run out? So this is a little bit out of our league since we're not the office that runs Section 18, but Section 18 is offered as applications are reviewed and approved. Once approved, PHAs then request vouchers is the second part of that process, and those vouchers are subject to appropriation. So HUD gets a certain amount of funds in its tenant protection voucher account, and once in a while over the years has had to tell folks have had to delay the issuance of those vouchers. Typically not. Typically they've been available, but they are always subject to the availability of appropriations. So we can't always predict whether those funds will be available based on your timeline for your application. The question on a Section 18 RAD combined deal, are the residents returning to or living in the Section 18 PBV units subject to rescreening? So that is, if you've got a project that's using the RAD and Section 18 blend, and 25% of the units will go through Section 18 and be replaced and preserved under regular project-based vouchers, are those residents subject to rescreening? And the answer is no. There's a provision in the revision 3 of the RAD notice that says not only for RAD residents, not only are RAD residents not subject to rescreening, but if there are other project-based vouchers at the property, residents moving into those, if they're former residents that are now moving into those units, they are also not subject to rescreening. Okay, we have a question. If we submitted a letter of interest for a portfolio award, do we need to submit full applications for all projects or only for the projects we plan on redeveloping this year? So if you submitted a letter of interest and now HUD said it's time to come in with your application or your portfolio award or your multi-phase award or a mix of those three, then you need to pay attention to the part of the RAD notice that describes how each of those works. So if you are requesting if you're only planning, or if you're only able to move forward on a certain project at this time, and you likely want to request a portfolio award in which you give us applications, actual completed applications, which will result in CHAPs, for half of the projects in your portfolio, and then we'll issue, list which projects you want to have on your portfolio award, and we'll then produce CHAPs for the properties for which you submitted applications, and provide your portfolio award covering the remainder of the units and properties. So it's not, you don't just give us the applications for what you have, what you're planning to do this year. You'd have to give us applications for everything that you are for 50% of the properties in your portfolio that you're applying for. Did the gentleman say that if you do not pay a developer fee until after RAD conversion, public housing procurement rules do not apply? There is no gentleman talking on this webinar, but yes, we did say that any payments that are made after conversion are not subject to public housing procurement rules, even if services are provided prior to conversion. How late in the conversion process can a CHAP be traded in order to take advantage of the new RAD rents? So as long as you have not recorded the RAD use agreement, you can request a CHAP amendment to utilize the current RAD rents. Can I clarify the distinction between portfolio award and multi-phase awards and what is required by this notice? So multi-phase award is an award covering the redevelopment of an overall project that can happen in phases. This can give you substantially more time, up to 2024, to submit all of your applications and get moving on the redevelopment, but is generally constrained to a project. A portfolio award covers your overall portfolio of public housing properties. And for a portfolio award, you give us applications, actual completed applications, which include board approval and resident meetings and comments for half of the applications and or for half the properties, and then you provide a list of the properties that you want on the portfolio award.
But it doesn't have to be all the properties.
Correct. Yeah, it's a self-defined portfolio. If your PHA is not converting everything, all of its public housing properties, that's okay. It's, however, whatever a self-defined portfolio of your public housing properties. Yeah, so with respect to the developer fee incentive for properties adopting a preference for people exiting homelessness or permanent supportive housing, does this, how is it applied? And so it, for current tax credit deals, we limit the developer fee to 15% of total development costs, less acquisition, reserves, and the developer fee itself. That is, and that's for the undeferred portion of the developer fee. So this would be a 25% boost in the undeferred portion of the developer fee, still subject, of course, to state tax credit requirements. More Section 18 questions. Again, this is probably Section 18 questions are best sent to sacta@hud.gov. We'll do our best to answer them here. What are the requirements for Section 18 for scattered site units? So take a look at PIH Notice 2018-04. scattered site is another category of properties that for which HUD has made Section 18 disposition approval much simpler. The properties do not need to be demonstrated to be obsolete, but please refer to that notice and follow up with sacta@hud.gov if you have further questions on the requirements there. We're asked which materials were we looking for feedback on. We're always looking for feedback on all of our materials because they, as folks may have noticed, this program has evolved consistently and hopefully is not devolved. So we're always looking for feedback on anything we put out. But one of the key areas is the decision tree or repositioning toolkit for small PHAs. What are all of the things that PHAs should consider when deciding whether to remain as public housing, to go through Section 18, or to use RAD or Streamlined RAD conversion. Specifically, we're trying to develop a toolkit for small PHAs and have gotten some really good feedback just from conversations with folks around the country on key considerations, but are always looking for more. Says the question, was Section 18 involved if we're demolishing and replacing units on the same site through RAD? So if you are demolishing and redeveloping units only through RAD and preserving substantially all the assistance, there's no need to get Section 18 demolition approval. The RAD approval provides for the demolition, the approval of the demolition, as well as the disposition of the property into a tax credit partnership, and the removal of the public housing declaration of trust, and the new execution of the Section 8.5 contract. Question, would small PHAs get regular replacement vouchers at normal rents or at RAD rents? So it depends what option you go through. If you're converting through RAD, then it's at the RAD published rents, which are sometimes lower, sometimes higher, sometimes just about the same as normal Section 8 rents. If you go through Section 18, the rents are normal voucher rent levels. If you're able to project base them back at the property. So that is probably the biggest consideration a PHA should account for when making a decision between RAD and Section 18. And oftentimes the Section 18 rents will be, or the rents that a PHA could get if it went through Section 18 and then project-based vouchers at the same site, often those rents would be better than the rents available through RAD. Follow-up procurement question, can RAD consultants be selected without following public housing procurement requirements if they are paid prior to conversion? No, any expenses, a public housing property is a public housing property up until the time of conversion. So public housing rules apply up until that time. And so if there are services being rendered to support the redevelopment of a public housing property and the expenses are paid prior to conversion, public housing procurement rules apply. Can the utility allowance be increased from the original CHAP amounts? How does that affect gross rents? There's a number of different permutations of this. First of all, if in your CHAP, we include the utility allowance that's in effect at the property today. So yes, the utility allowances should always change if you're updating your utility allowance for a property in the public housing program from year to year. That should be updated in the CHAP, and it just gets added on. So the gross rent, the contract rent stays the same, the gross rent changes. If prior to conversion you are changing who's paying for the utilities, we don't see this much, but it's worth noting. If prior to conversion, essentially between the time that you applied and the time you convert, you've decided I'm going to push all these utilities to the residents, or they're going the other way, they're all going to be property paid, then there would be you'd have a dollar for dollar increase in the utility allowance, increase or decrease in the utility allowance, and a decrease or increase in the contract rent. So we're asked, will you be updating the RAD tools? Can you provide an option for small PHAs to see if the RAD rents or HCV, housing choice vouchers, would be better for conversion? So we are working on updating the inventory assessment tool. The other thing to say is that on the rents that we've posted, the modified FY 2016 RAD rents, that spreadsheet also includes the fair market rents, which is at least a proxy for what the housing choice voucher rents are. Rents under the housing choice voucher program are locally assessed. They're based on, they're capped at 110% of the fair market rent, but they're set at the reasonable rent, which is essentially the market rent, which HUD does not know because we're not in every market. So only the housing authority can precisely say what the project-based voucher rents are. But we can do our best to provide at least proxy data. So something we'll work on. Thank you. Question: who is required to be the owner in a small PHA conversion? It's the same as for any other conversion. So the housing authority can own the property directly, can own it through an affiliate, could hand it over to its nonprofit, could hand it over to a third-party nonprofit, could following conversion could transfer it into a tax credit entity if there's going to be a refinancing down the road, as long as the property continues to be controlled at least by a public or nonprofit entity. So RAD has unique ownership and control requirements that require ongoing affiliation with a public or nonprofit body at the property. With regard to my last response about paying for services prior to conversion, please confirm you would not be subject to federal procurement regs if you use non-public housing funds. Correct. But you're still subject, as a PHA is still subject, of course, to what its charter says. And certainly in a lot of cases, PHAs have a uniform procurement policy regardless of the funds it's using. So please pay attention to those. Okay. Thank you all for joining. We again apologize for the confusion at the beginning of this call, the false start. This session will be recorded and posted, as well as materials. We'll consider doing another session given that the difficulties we had getting everybody on. But thank you for those who were able to join and engage and ask good questions. Have a good afternoon.